Aggie, what is the latest? Aggie Chambray joins me. She's LBC's political correspondent. Aggie, what is the latest you're hearing now from the inside?
Well, the latest since we last spoke, Ali, is that Sue Gray has already been replaced as Chief of Staff. So Morgan McSweeney, who was, you may have heard this about this power struggle between the two of them. He is now Chief of Staff, and Sue Gray has been appointed as the Prime Minister's envoy for nations and regions. Now, Ali, we had been picking up that something was going on from about 7 p.m. last night. So my colleague, our political editor, Natasha Clark, and I were asking a lot of questions of Downing Street, of people in and around government, and just absolutely getting radio silence, which is usually a sign that something might be going on. Then our colleague, Lewis Goodall, this morning asked Peter Kyle whether Sue Gray was still in post. And he didn't really respond. He said, I don't want to kind of talk about public servants, but she has done, interesting turn of phrase there, kind of brilliant work, and just would not engage with whether or not she would still be in post in a month, whether or not she was still in post. So that kind of raised our hackles even more, should I say. And then in the last half an hour, I received confirmation that it was about to be announced that Sue Gray was going to resign, or had resigned, as Chief of Staff, which we obviously spoke about in that moment. And since then, it has been confirmed. Now, Sue Gray put out a statement saying it's been an honour to take on the role of Chief of Staff. But she did say, however, in recent weeks, it has become clear that intense commentary around my position risked becoming a distraction to the government's vital work of change. It is for that reason, she said, that she has chosen to stand aside. Now, Sir Keir did thank Sue for all the support she had given him, both in opposition and in government. But today as well, the Prime Minister has made 5 new appointments to strengthen, their words, his Downing Street operation. And those are, as I mentioned at the beginning, Morgan McSweeney moves to Chief of Staff. Vidya Alakassan and Jill Cuthbertson have been promoted to Deputy Chiefs of Staff. And Vidya is currently the political director at Number 10. So some new appointments there. James Lyons as well, who was the NHS Director of Comms, is going to head up a new strategic comms team. But look, Ali, this is really big news. This is a bit of a political earthquake. This is the reset that some people have been calling out for, and also the end of that power struggle between Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray, as it was reported to be. It sounds like Morgan McSweeney has won, Sue Gray has resigned of Chief of Staff, and he is in.
Hold on there for a second, Aggie, because I'm going to come back to you in a minute. But I'm just reflecting what you're saying. And the question I actually think I want to ask the listeners this hour is, what does this actually say about this new Labour government? I mean, what does it actually say that within 100 days you've got your Chief of Staff who's now been dismissed or fallen on her sword or resigned or whatever it is? I mean, we heard all sorts of issues about her, what was it, lobbying for some football stadium or something, one minute being paid more than the Prime Minister, the next minute, briefings consistently going on. Since the Labour government came into power, briefings behind the scenes about Sue Gray consistently not really being a true Labour person. I mean, this is someone who we were led to believe when she was doing that inquiry into COVID parties was someone completely beyond reproach. So I do find it rather odd and dysfunctional. So my question to you is this: what does the resignation of Sue Gray say about the new Labour government? 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Aggie, what's the answer to the question?
Well, I think what it says about this new Labour government is that they are finding governing much harder than they thought they might. Yeah. I think they felt Sue Gray in opposition had prepared very well for that sort of transition from opposition to government. It is difficult, and I think they have found it really bumpy, and a lot of that has been blamed on her. When I have spoken to people behind the scenes, they've said, oh, well, I thought she was preparing for government. But it is a really, really difficult transition anyway, and hasn't been done, as we know, for kind of 14 years was the last time that kind of transition of parties happened. And so I think that has been difficult. I think there's been a lot of briefings that perhaps they weren't expecting. I think part of that came from a dispute about money, about cash, and also about the way that Number 10 has been set up. And there have been a lot of comments about it not functioning well. But I think that brings us back to point one, over that transition between opposition and government being difficult, and more difficult than they were prepared for. There has been lots of talk about the fact that this Labour government hasn't kind of given enough of a narrative, given enough announcements, talked enough about what they want to do or who they are. I think part of that is also because Sue Gray, at her very core, is a civil servant. Now, she's been on the political side in this chief of staff role, but one of the criticisms I've heard is that there isn't someone in there, or hasn't been someone in there, who's truly political, who's basically acting as that gatekeeper. And I think people have said, oh, well, Keir Starmer's actually quite new to politics. He only became an MP in 2015. Yep. He was only a leader for 5 years before he got into government. And so I think there has been talk that they need someone more political at Downing Street's heart. And that is something that, no one could deny that Morgan McSweeney is a very political operator.
Well, you absolutely. Sue Gray is regarded as a political operator herself, and she was a very senior civil servant, as you say, Aggie. I mean, it was very interesting that the Liberal Democrat former minister David Laws, in his memoir, recalls being told by a colleague, "It took me precisely 2 years before I realised who it is that runs Britain." And the answer to that is Sue Gray, because she is everywhere. She was the head of ethics at the Cabinet Office. She did the party investigation in the Downing Street parties. And do you remember at the time, Aggie, when all these Conservative ministers were being rolled out in studios like this here at LBC to be talking about parties and how defensible it was, and they were saying the standard response was, "We're waiting for Sue Gray." I remember someone invited me for dinner, and I said, "Sorry, I can't come. I'm waiting for Sue Gray." And now we're in a situation where, in no time at all, this civil servant, apparently hugely experienced, above reproach, is now in a situation where it's been attacked from all sides. And Aggie, the other thing is this: what does it tell you about? What does it say about the role of the chief of staff when some people within the party have been really worried about the inability of the prime minister or his close team to see around corners? For example, Wardrobegate. I mean, the very fact that Starmer is a holier-than-thou figure and made a virtue of criticising the Tories on freebies and the whole crony culture, and actually made a virtue of this on Downing Street, saying that, we're going to tread lightly on people's lives. And then with only a few weeks has to give $6,000 back. No one really can understand why, but they're still keeping 30 grand's worth of suits. Surely Sue Gray should have been advising him on that. I mean, is she just not very good at her job? Is that why she's gone?
Well, we obviously don't know what the advice was indeed in Freebie-gate and another situation. We don't know whether she was screaming out and telling him, sort this out immediately, get a more coherent line on this immediately. But I think the point of a chief of staff is you are effectively blamed if your prime minister, your premier is not doing as well as they could do. If the advice isn't good enough, if you are making mistakes, then immediately the blame goes to the chief of staff. And so the problem with these elongated, I'm not going to call them scandals, but elongated problems, like with the Freebie-gate, people ask questions about Sir Keir's political judgment. And by doing that, they're asking questions about his chief of staff and her political judgment. Well, why didn't she see that coming as you do then? The problem with not sacking her, she has resigned, as we understand it. But the problem with her going is then it, I suppose, makes him more vulnerable going forward. So he's obviously got a new chief of staff, but were these problems to continue, I think the questions get asked more loudly. Well, is it Sir Keir? Why isn't he sorting this out rather than his chief of staff? So it does kind of add a layer of vulnerability, I would say, getting rid of her and putting someone else in. But it will be interesting to see how she does in this other role, and also the fact that she hasn't been sacked, but she has said it was becoming a distraction. I mean, it sounds very much like the words I think it was Alistair Campbell gave when he resigned as chief of staff. But she didn't hang around long, did she? I mean, it's just
she didn't, and it
didn't
also
make it to 100 days.
It also reminds me of Andy Coulson when he was David Cameron's chief spin doctor. He was the head of communications and got into all sorts of issues with an investigation about phone hacking and all the rest of it, and said quite clearly, when the person who's meant to be the PR agent becomes the story, you got a problem. It's the same thing with the chief of staff. Chief of staff is a hugely important role. I used to know Ed Llewellyn quite well in terms of what he did with David Cameron. It is a gatekeeper role. You are the lightning rod. You're meant to be taking the flak for the prime minister. You're meant to be dealing with all the issues. I mean, you are effectively the second in command, really. I mean, yes, there are official ministers out there, but you are meant to be the gatekeeper protecting your boss from everything. And what also we've read in recent weeks, Aggie, is that decision-making within the government has been very slow and very clunky because everything was being routed by and through Sue Gray, that's leading to dysfunctional government.
Yes, and I think that comes back to the point about it being difficult to go from opposition to government. I think they have found it quite difficult from what I've read, from what I've heard, having kind of a dynamic decision-making process. And I think sometimes things have gone into number 10 and not kind of got to the Prime Minister, and that has led to frustration with it from ministers, from civil servants, even from MPs. So I think that has been a frustration, that has been a criticism. But as I say, they will be hoping that this is fixed very, very quickly, and then they can say, oh, well, Sue Gray was the problem, rather than this entire administration is the problem, and Sir Keir isn't very good at governing, isn't very good at politics. You could imagine those question marks coming quite quickly if number 10 doesn't get itself into a better state very quickly, and those, the decision-making, the comms, the problems not being sorted out quickly enough don't get sorted, then I think that people will ask, well, was it Sue Gray's fault or was it your fault?
I think it's a very interesting question. Aggie, thank you very much indeed.